Thank you.
And I did have a question about lab today. Do we need that empty quarter milk carton?
We need a way to save your soap you make so it turns into a solid bar. Um, so we need something to put it in. Worst case is we can use weighing trays for those people that didn't bring a quart container. See, the problem with making soap is most people don't understand that the reaction takes months to complete. And if you use it too soon, you end up having residual lye in your soap. So you have to make sure all the lye is reacted. Otherwise, you're going to have very irritative soap, which is not nice. Particularly gets when you use it around your face and particularly your eyes. Very, very harsh. So anyway, did that answer your question?
Um, so we just need a container in general.
Yeah, and the quart containers are nice because they have a pretty good kind of anti-sticking um, surface, whether it's a wax or some other kind of coating. So when you try to get your soap out, it kind of pops out easily. Otherwise, you're gonna have to kind of dig it out.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so everyone, all right, so let's jump back over here. Okay, so the big thing here is differentiating between fats versus oil. So they're both triglycerides. And that is, oops, these guys here. So what determines the difference between a fat and oil? It depends on the fatty acid components. Shorter chain fatty acids give more liquidy soap than long chain fatty acids. Also, it has to do with the degree of saturation. If you're working with polyunsaturated fatty acids, then they tend to be more liquid, the eventual soap you end up creating. If you work with saturated fats, like coming from pork or beef, uh, the soap you make tends to be much harder. So, for example, ivory soap probably is mostly made from uh, uh, lard, pig fat, um, because it's pretty solid. Now, the reason why it floats, by the way, is they inject air into it so that it's light. Um, so we're going to be basically making ivory soap today, or this week, I should say. Okay, so looking at this here, very generic triglyceride, or TG. So this guy starts off as a three carbon triol. Okay, so it's got three hydroxyl groups, and those hydroxyl groups coupled with the fatty acid is what makes the esters. Now, sometimes we have more complicated triglycerides. Sometimes there is a phosphate group here, which ends up making a phospholipid. Oops, didn't spell that right. Such as a membrane. Okay, and another characteristic is they're very non-polar. which is a key component when you're using a fatty acid glycerol triglyceride as a membrane component, because you want to make sure that the polar areas that are undergoing water-based reactions are separated from other water-based reactions. And the way our bodies do it, or biological systems do it, is through cellular membranes. And there's nuclear membranes and mitochondrium, all kinds of cellular organelles have membranes in them. And they're mostly made up of phospholipids, and they have portals in them for passive and active transport. So if you want to get something through that membrane that's polar, then there's a way to do that. I mentioned a minute or so ago the mixtures of the fatty acids on the triglyceride is what makes physical characteristics of the resulting fat that you make. For example, here we've got, this would be saturated, unsaturated, unsaturated. So that ratio of these three fatty acids on the esters backbone here will end up coming out the same as when we saponify that. Remember now, this process here is a saponification. That is ester in a strong alkaline environment and the itchy nose will yield a so on a test, if I ask you a question, can this be saponified? Okay, you look for one, an ester, and two, what the pH of the environment is. If both those are present, then you can saponify it. Doesn't have to be triglyceride, it can be just any ester. Now, if the base is the sodium base, like sodium hydroxide, then the salts are all going to be sodium based. Now, this is the common name. It comes from palmitic acid. Which is 16 carbons long. So that would be sodium hexadecanoate. So this process, by the way, is how they make biodiesel. Okay, this is called esterification. So if we start with a triglyceride, we saponify it. So this is a TG. We saponify it to acid salts. Then we take those acid salts and hook it up with methanol. The to be the alcohol. You end up with biodiesel. The biodiesel versus naturally occurring diesel are not the same. They burn the same, but chemically they're not the same because this is an ester and this is a hydrocarbon. When I was young, back in the 60s, we used to have these buses that would run all over the country, particularly in along the West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington, where they used to have big signs on the side of these buses that the bus is running on biodiesel. In those days, the biodiesel was free. All you needed to do was go to restaurants and dump their grease containers in the back. It was a messy job, but it was free. Nowadays, you have to actually purchase it. It's not free anymore. But anyway, biodiesel is very easy to make. Okay, so if we were taking glycerol with stearic acid, that's a 18 carbon unsaturated acid, we'd end up with this tristearate, glycerol tristearate triglyceride. Lipase is the enzyme that breaks apart esters, and usually it's associated with triglyceride esters. So this happens in your small intestine, and it requires a pH of around 7. Physiological pH is 704 just in general, and it varies. But basically, lipase requires a pretty neutral environment. Now, what's interesting is when you eat a big fatty piece of meat, the protein is digested in your stomach with an enzyme called protease, and it requires a pH of around 2. So when that whole glunk comes out of your stomach and is dumped into your small intestine, that pH needs to be brought up to 7 before the amylase and the lipase enzymes can work effectively. Okay. So in a low pH environment, we end up making the acids as opposed to the acid salts. So and this is what we're doing today, or this week, making soap. Now, one of the important things, the surfactants, emulsifiers, and soap require no exceptions. So you got to have both of them present to be a surfactant and a emulsifier. And then what that does, it acts like a glue to glue the polar molecules together and the non-polar molecules together. And it's in between them. Is there a question that was arising that I hear? Okay. Okay, besides the mixture of fatty acids on the triglyceride, it also depends on what kind of um, um, alkaline you're using, whether it's potassium-based or sodium-based, give you different soaps. Okay. Now, a long time ago, pioneers used to make soap by whenever they would slaughter an animal, they would keep, particularly pigs, they would keep the fat, and then they would come up with a source of sodium hydroxide. And they did that by having a wood fire, and then the ashes they would take and run through water, and that would extract out the sodium and potassium hydroxide. And then you'd boil it. My grandmother used to, in Texas, she was very poor, and she had a farm there, and she used to make her own soap. Now she used to buy the lye. She didn't get it from wood, but she used to make her own soap. And you have this big cauldron on the back of the yard, maybe 40 or 50 gallons of boiling lye, which is very dangerous. I kept telling her, but she didn't listen to me. Also, interestingly, Romans had soap. And then when the Roman Empire fell, the sanitation changed drastically, at least for the majority of the people in those days. And there was a time when there weren't a lot of bathing going on. Also, they lost the art of making soap. I was just watching a documentary regarding the plague, and the vector by which the bacteria was carried was on fleas that were on rodents, and that's why it spreads so quickly. And once you have an unclean environment and very congested living conditions, that was easier to spread that way. The mechanism by which Black Plague works is via there's a gene. It's got a number here, but it is 32. Whether that gene is expressed or not will determine whether you fall prey to the Black Plague. And AIDS. It's the same gene. So people that are immune to AIDS have an expressed gene 32, and it depends whether it's a homogeneous or a heterogeneous. In other words, whether you have it fully populated, whether you have absolute immunity or partial immunity. It's very interesting. And this is fairly recent too. This is in the last 10, 15 years this was discovered. Okay. Now, hydrogenation. You have an unsaturated fat, meaning it has double bonds. You have a process with hydrogen gas under pressure with a catalyst, in this case, platinum, and you end up with a saturated fat. So the physical characteristics change. When you saturate the fat. For example, this is one it's a problem because if this is going to be an edible fat, you're creating trans fats if you don't go to 100% saturation. Crisco used to take vegetable oil, hydrogenate it, and it to mimic lard. The problem is you ended up with a trans lard, and that was extremely unhealthy. And Crisco was worrying about going out of business back when they were starting to actually measure the amount of cis and trans fats available in foods. So they ended up making Crisco differently now. They end up blending vegetable oils rather than hydrogenating vegetable oils to get that saturation level. And now there's very little trans fat in Crisco, but they almost went out of business. So this would be hydrogenation. They're using nickel as a catalyst instead of platinum, but there's a number of metals that are commonly used for catalyzing hydrogenation reactions. So when you have low pH, you get the glycerol plus fatty acids. When you have a high pH, you end up with the glycerol plus the fatty acid salts. And when you hydrogenate the triglyceride, you end up with a more saturated triglyceride. Now, if you're starting with a totally saturated triglyceride, nothing's going to happen if you hydrogenate it. Hydrogenation only works over double bonds. So if the fatty acids have no double bonds, you're not going to get any change. Okay, so anyone have any questions about the simplest, almost the simplest triglyceride reactions, physical characteristics, how to make it, what is saponification, what is a surfactant or soap or lost for words here. Emulsifier. Okay. Last night around 3 o'clock, I had a blinking red lights coming through my windows, and it was a fire truck and an ambulance right outside my window. Of course, it was very disturbing. I mean, someone had called 911, so I was up for quite a while last night. I'm sure that's why I couldn't remember emulsifier. Okay, so any questions about triglycerides? Okay. All right. Now, a wax is the simplest one. It's simply a long acid and a long alcohol together. So there's no 3-carbon backbone. And this is like candle wax. Waxes are used a lot. And the chemistry of the wax depends on what acid you're using and what alcohol. But they're very simple. It's just a single ester. Okay, now I mentioned phospholipids. Now, that's the same as a triglyceride. Except the third alcohol is an ester with phosphoric acid. And then the phosphoric acid has another ester. So this is an ester. And this is an ester as well. Sometimes it's an amide, which we talked about. So amines and alcohols also bond with acids. One forms an ester, the other forms an amide. So this is the ester again. And this is the other ester. Frequently, this is called choline. Like frequently in biological circles, you have acetylcholine. Acetylcholinesterase is the enzyme that works on that. And many pesticides are cholinesterase inhibitors. That's how they work. And basically, they mess up all the phospholipids in your body. Hence you die. Okay, a very common phospholipid is something called lecithin. Who's heard of lecithin? Anyone? Has anyone made mayonnaise from scratch?
My parents do.
Do they put a egg yolk in their?
Yes, I think they put egg yolk first and they blend it to a little bit and then they add vinegar and oil.
Yeah.
Or yeah.
Yeah, and lecithin is contained in egg yolks. And that's why you have to add egg yolk to act as an emulsifier so that your vinegar and water will blend with the oils that you're pouring in. And it's just, so this is an it's an oil and water emulsion mayonnaise. You can use other ones as well. And a lot of sauces use egg yolks. Sometimes your emulsion will break. If your emulsion breaks, that means the oil and water separate out. So they're no longer homogeneous. So the phospholipid lecithin frequently is incorporated into cell membranes as well. Ethylamine is an alcohol with an amino group on it. This is what choline looks like. And these are attached. Okay, so these are attached right here, that R group. So a phosphatidylcholine, i.e. lecithin, looks like this. So here is the ester. Here is an ester. So if you look at this, is this an emulsifier? Why or why is it an emulsifier? Remember, we need a polar group and a non-polar group. So this part represents the polar part. This part represents the non-polar part. Hence, it can act as an emulsifier. Okay, now it's important to be able to recognize an emulsifier. I'm going to ask you on your test that question. You have to say, I don't see much of anything here that's polar. This is as polar as it gets, and then you've got these long, long, long chains of non-polar atoms attached. Remember, after carbon number 7, the acid becomes overall non-polar. And these are way beyond. This one here is, this is C18. This is, let's see, 1, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is C18 also. So they're really, really long fatty acids. So this is probably linoleic acid, the middle one, and this would be stearic acid, top of them. Same thing. Anything ionic is very polar. So as soon as you see ionic, bam, polar. And then same thing here, non-polar. Okay, so the 3-carbon backbone doesn't have to be glycerol. In this case, we've got this guy, and this guy are different looking than the normal glycerol. Normal glycerol does not have an exposed hydroxyl group, and it has no amino groups. We can have glycolipids, which means it is a carb plus a lipid. And carbohydrates, remember, so they're easy to form esters, this is a hydroxyl group acting as an alcohol. So this is similar to lecithin, except the backbone is not. Glycerol. It's the single myelin here. Okay, now I use this as a test question on one of my tests. I said, okay, this is a glycolipid. Okay, and in this case, we have galactose attached at carbon number 1. That's the anomeric carbon in a 6-membered ring. That'd be carbon number 6 up here, number 4 here. Okay, so this reducing sugar, how do you know if it's a reducing sugar or not?
We check if it's a hemiacetal.
Exactly. Have to have it hemiacetal. So do we have a hemiacetal present? Well, we have OCO. We have OH present on carbon number 1, the anomeric carbon. No. And then we have the carbon hydrogen. So this is a acetal then, not a hemiacetal. Hence, it's not a reducing sugar. Also, acetals don't open up. Hemiacetals do, exposing the aldehyde. Also, I asked what kind of linkage this is. So what kind of, of course, it doesn't change. Okay, so what kind of galactose is that? Is that a alpha or beta galactose?
Is it beta?
Yes, that's correct. Why?
Because you look at the anomers, the first carbon, and you see whether it's going up or down to the side. And because it's going up, in this case, it's a beta one.
Perfect. Yes, that's a very nice answer. Yes. Beta goes up, alpha goes down at anomeric carbon number 1. And in this case, it's going up. So, and also all carbs in our body are D's, not L's. So it goes without saying this would be a D galactose. So the other question is, so this is no. What about being a emulsifier? So polar, non-polar. Present. So what do you guys think? Would this be an emulsifier? Well, non-polar or polar parts? Well, ask yourself, does sugar dissolve in water easily? All of you know the answer to this. Did you guys stay up late last night too? Of course, sugar dissolves in water easily. Hence, it's polar. That's the polar part. That's nonpolar because it's longer than 7. And this is much longer than 7. Oh, yes, this is an emulsifier.
What do you mean when you say 7 again for the non-polar parts? Are you talking about 7 carbons or?
Yeah, 7 carbons.
Okay,
Remember
so if
those graphs that were, if it's 7 carbons or longer, then the long fatty acid part takes over the polar parts. So the whole molecule ends up being nonpolar. And the longer the fatty acid chain is, the more nonpolar it is.
okay, and if it's under 7, it's always going to be polar or
Yeah.
no?
Yes, under 7, it'll be polar. That's a really good point, because then you don't have enough of the fatty acid chain to overcome the polar part of the acid. And esters are even less polar than acids.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay, these are typical test questions. Okay, so you have to look at this, then you're going to go emulsifier, polar, non-polar, reducing sugar is a hemiacetal present. You should be able to identify that this is also galactose. And this here, carbon number 4 is the key on that. Glucose goes down, galactose goes up. Okay, now, these are also all what we've talked about so far are saponifiable. So in an alkaline environment, this thing would come apart because we have an amide, which acts like an ester. We haven't covered those yet, but amide and esters act very similarly. So this would come apart. Also, would break up the acetal into a hemiacetal. Okay. Steroids have no esters in them. So they're not, one, saponifiable. They won't break up in acidic conditions because there are no esters. So you guys know these 3 dots, what it means? Means therefore. Okay, no esters, therefore it will not break up. And low pH or high pH. Won't saponify. Because of this, the very non-polar. We all know about cholesterol. Because cholesterol has an OL on it, there must be some hydroxyl groups there. And here we are. So if I asked you on a test, we have cholesterol, and then we have this guy. By the way, you need to know the ring system. So we have 3 6-sided, 1 5-sided ring. If I had a bare and this is a simple steroid. Okay, so I had a simple steroid, the test question, and cholesterol, which would be more soluble in water?
Cholesterol,
Why? That's correct. Why?
the OH group.
Yep, exactly. It's got that lone hydroxyl group. Even though cholesterol is pretty nonpolar, but compared to the simple steroid with no hydroxyl group, it's going to be more polar, hence more soluble in water. Good, good answer. Okay. Now this guy, would this molecule be an emulsifier? Well, nonpolar, polar parts. So that's the polar part, especially with this ions there, very polar and nonpolar. So yes. So going back to that fatty dinner you had, and then it gets dumped into your small intestine. Your gallbladder holds bile created from your liver, and it squeezes out bile into your small intestine, acts as an emulsifier, and breaks up those big giant pieces of fat into small micelles or globules, so that the enzyme lipase can work more effectively. Now, right, arachidonic acid is a 20-carbon acid. Okay, it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so it's an omega 6, and then delta 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 11, 14 acid. Now the importance of arachidonic acid is it's a precursor to production of prostaglandins. Now the enzyme is called COX-1, COX-2, and COX stands for cyclooxidase. So basically, it takes this arachidonic, long fatty acid, where it's bent in the middle here, because of all these cis double bonds, and it makes these two slightly different prostaglandins. Now, when you take an NSAID, like aspirin or ibuprofen or naproxen or whatever, it inhibits COX-1 and COX-2. One of the problems is it inhibits blood clotting. So if you have a tendency to have an ulcer in your stomach, that's why they say don't take aspirin, because you produce prostaglandins that inhibit blood clotting. Now, COX-1 produces the good prostaglandin. COX-2 produces the bad prostaglandin. Okay, this is pain relief. Anti-inflammatory. This prevents clotting. So what they're trying to do now is to work on drugs that only inhibit COX-2 processes, not COX-1. So that the goodness of COX-1 produced prostaglandins, we have pain relief and inflammatory, and then we minimize the production of the prostaglandins that prevents blood clotting, for example. But they're very expensive drugs right now. They haven't been out for very long. Every time I get I'm signed up to get a COVID booster this week along with my flu shot. I always talk to the pharmacist about COX-1 and COX-2 stuff. Anyway, so this is one reason why you need to have arachidonic acid in your diet. When you look at these two forms, there's not a lot of difference there. The only difference is right there. Okay, I've already shared with you this page. And then it'll be these guys. Now our test on Unit 2 isn't for a while. So what I'd like to do starting Wednesday, it's just gonna go over lots of reactions, go over the old tests, and just kind of review before we start Unit 3. Unit 3, I'd like to have a full 2 days of review, if not 3, because we're kind of ahead of schedule a little bit here. So we do have some flexibility. Here's our arachidonic acid right here. Now with these acids, you need to be able to do the omega naming. You need to do the actual let's go with what you need to know in this. Okay, you need to know the common name. You need to know the IUPAC name. You need to know the delta and the omega-6 designation. And the blue ones are the ones I want you to memorize. If I give you one of these guys, like arachidonic acid on a test, you then need to be able to do the delta, omega, and the IUPAC name for it. Okay, but I'll give you this guy. Okay. Also, if you buy omega-3 fatty acids as a supplement, you won't see the dodecahexaenoic acid, you'll see the DHA and EPA. Okay, well, that concludes Unit 2. And again, the rest of the days, I want to do reactions. And kind of questions like I did. Is this an emulsifier? How do you know it's an emulsifier? You know, that kind of stuff. Is this a reducing sugar? Those kind of questions. Okay, and I decided to have a take-home component of this test as well. And I'll give you at least 4 days up front on it, and it'll be due. You bring it in and you turn it in with your test. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, well. Who needed to talk to me about their orange distillation lab? Someone I talked to said we would figure it out this week. Are you going to be in lab today? Well, whoever,
Are you referring to the, I think you're referring to me, Professor, the lab or the pre-lab? Are you talking about the assignment?
yeah, did you get it? Yeah, if you and I have been exchanging emails, I need to look on my,
Yes, we have been.
okay, all right. Are you in today's lab or Wednesday?
Today's lab.
Okay, well, let's talk about it and I'll show you exactly what you need to do, okay? To fix it.
Perfect. That sounds good.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, we're going to end early today. So on, again, on Wednesday, what I'm going to do is go through just some real general questions. I'm going to go over some old tests as well and give you an idea of what typically, I'll show you some past take-home problems as well. One problem I'll probably give you is on vitamin B12. I'll give you the structure of vitamin B12. And when I was little, I had asthma really bad. And I would miss like every week during asthma season, I would miss like 2 and 3 days a week. My asthma was so bad. And the only treatment in the 50s for asthma was vitamin B12 shots. The problem with them is they were very, very viscous. And so the only muscle that could take it was your butt muscle. And what I would get injected there, and I couldn't walk for like 2 hours. It really, really was very, very uncomfortable. I remember my dad used to take me to the 5 and 10 cent store and he'd buy me those little peeps, those little chickens. And I remember that to this day. And that was a long time ago. That was 69 years ago. So vitamin B12 is a very interesting molecule. Anyway, there's a good chance I'll have that as one of the take-home problems. And then the question is how do you make it more motile in your blood? So you go through the functional groups and you would figure out how to make them more soluble in water. And then you'd have a potential reaction to the lid. Okay, any other questions? Okay, I will see Monday folks in a little while.